Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Markets and Morality, the show which looks beyond the left-right divide and considers issues which cut in different ways. I'm Emma Revell, Head of Public Affairs at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kristian Niemietz and Sam Armstrong to ask, should Britain be more relaxed about immigration? Kristian is a colleague of mine here at the IEA. He's worked here since 2008 and is currently our Head of Political Economy. He's the author of numerous books and academic papers, including one of our most downloaded publications, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, and more relevant to our conversation today, a 2019 report entitled Immigration, Picking the Low-Hanging Fruits. Sam Armstrong is Director of Communications at the Henry Jackson Society, a think tank which works across borders and across party lines to combat extremism, advance democracy and human rights, and make a stand in an increasingly uncertain world. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me. To kick off and just demonstrate to our viewers the breadth of opinion on what is often lumped together as the right, could you just start by explaining very, very briefly how you would define your own place on the political spectrum? Kristian, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I guess I would have called myself a libertarian, but nowadays, more often that is associated with very high levels of ideological purity, which I don't necessarily subscribe to. So I've gone back to just using the old-fashioned classical liberal label. That's good enough. A bit boring, but I think it suits me quite well.
It works for you. Sam, what about you?
I describe myself as probably classically liberal on economic matters, and then more conservative on social issues, not necessarily questions of morality, but on as a matter of public policy, on things like immigration. I'm a bit more conservative. I should say the Henry Jackson Society, much like the IEA, doesn't subscribe to a corporate view on any of those things.
Well, exactly. That's the whole point here today. And in this series, we're aiming to show that actually, there's a range of different views and we often all get lumped together. Kristian, in your report that I mentioned in the introduction, Immigration, Picking the Low-Hanging Fruit, you talked about the fact that Britons have often had a quite nuanced views on immigration. It's not as simple as clamping down on immigration is automatically popular, liberalising immigration is automatically unpopular. It's about how the framing of the debate is often not quite right. It's the cultural impact of immigration, not overall numbers. Can you explain that in a little more detail for people who haven't read the report?
Sure. What I meant by that is that when we talk about immigration, we're often mixing up two entirely separate subjects. One of them is the economic impact of migration, so the impact that migration has on, let's say, housing markets, the labor market, on public finances, public services, the healthcare system, and so forth. So that's the economics of it. And the second issue is the cultural impact. Immigration might lead to social disruption, and that it might just be the difficulties of having different cultures living together and having to rub along together. And those are two very different issues, and depending on which of the two you prioritize, depending on which of the two you think are more important or more challenging, you would draw very different conclusions for what an ideal immigration system should look like. Now, the problem is that when we talk about, when people express their concerns about migration or objections to migration, they usually talk about the economic impact or perceived economic impact. But I've reviewed a couple of surveys and studies that look into attitudes to migration. And I've found that isn't really true. That doesn't seem to be the real issue. It seems to be that the anxieties around migration have much more to do with the cultural impact, with issues of integration. And the trouble is that people feel that they can't express their fears around those issues because they're terrified of being branded racists. Because this, for far too long, this issue has been dominated by the progressive left, and that is just what the progressive left does. They like calling people racists. Now, this has totally toxified the immigration debate because people feel that they cannot express a perfectly valid concern, perfectly valid objection without immediately being lumped together with with far right figures, and that has made the whole issue far more toxic than it needs to be. That has toxified the issue much more than anything to do with migration itself. It's more the framing and the debate around it. That's where that's what makes it so toxic. And what I'm saying is we should quite clearly distinguish between these two issues, and we shouldn't, when we're worried about the cultural impact, we shouldn't pretend that this is about access to GP surgeries or public services. What happens is that people rationalize their cultural concerns in economic terms, but that is often not the real issue, but we pretend that it is, and then we draw the wrong conclusions. We pretend that it's all about the economics and the impact on public services, and we pretend that it's all about numbers, and we therefore go for numeric solutions. We go for solutions that focus on overall numbers, and with those solutions then don't address the real issue. So you can see this in the net migration target. That's purely about numbers. That's just one big macro level number. And there was also a cap on the number of visas for skilled migrants, and that's now been abolished, but that was in place for several years. And attempts to reduce the number of students coming here. So it's all been about numbers, when that for most people isn't really the issue. And so we get responses to the wrong problem, and we get a totally messed up immigration policy as a result.
Sam, I can see you shaking your head there. I mean, where do you stand on the government's target, which is still unmet, by the way, to get net migration down to the tens of thousands? The last year that I was able to find data for, ending in March 2020, it was at around 313,000 rather than, under 100,000.
Yeah, so I'm a supporter of the tens of thousands targets, and it's for the sole reason that I agree with Kristian broadly on the framing that you've got to distinguish economics out from the cultural issues. And I think, roughly speaking, the UK society is probably capable of properly integrating, not the sort of failed attempts at integration we've seen in this country, that level of people into the UK each year quite well. And actually, I think if you can limit immigration down to those numbers, actually what you'll find is very strong public support for immigration. So one point I've come back on Kristian about is around the economics, which is we have set up a system of limits as to who can come into this country and go out, all the rest of it, that incentivize certain types of immigration and not others. So it is without a doubt the case that the UK immigration model has skewed those who've come into the UK actually away from exactly what the new system is about, which is about high-skilled workers, towards low-skilled workers. And that does have an impact on economics. I think there has to be a clear case made that it has contributed to a degree of wage suppression in certain industries. And those economics issues are not a feature of immigration per se, that they're a feature of where we've chosen to draw our lines on immigration and where immigration to the UK has come from. It's a very different set of problems to that Australia has, that has actually a relatively permissive system in terms of numbers per population of immigration. But it is chosen where it is chosen on exactly which groups of people it should permit in under its immigration controls. It's ended up with a very different type of, a very different profile of your average immigrant. And that changes the economics, the economic impact, because you're with different people, you're likely to have different effects on the market. And when you're talking about, as you say, a net immigration figure of 300,000 into a wage pool, a working age pool of around 30 million, we're talking real numbers that in certain sectors can have an impact on the market.
I mean, Sam, I can take from that you're probably broadly positive about the government's new immigration points-based system. Why do you think that is better than, any other way of managing immigration?
Well, starting from first principles, you have to have some limits on immigration. I don't think any other than the most extreme libertarians would, or indeed extreme individuals on the left of politics, would say that a no border system would work well. We're talking about, I think there have been polls done of sub-Saharan Africa, and we're talking about 30% of them would choose to emigrate to the West if given the opportunity. You would see a population dwarfed very quickly by levels of immigration coming in. I think there's a series of reasons why that wouldn't work very well. So drawing from that, you've got to decide who to let in and who not to let in. Now, successive governments have looked at different ways of doing that. And my view is you get the maximum benefit from immigration for the country, for the economy, and the minimum drawbacks if you are taking into people who are high earners, well educated, able to make an immediate contribution both economically and socially to the fabric of society, rather than doing so, rather than drawing in people who are low earners, so the net economic benefit, though I think remains, is a more limited one, and particularly in cases where you see low levels of English speaking or different cultural values, your social costs are much higher for that level of for that form of immigration. So my view is that the points-based system doesn't work around a cap. It lets in infinite numbers that meet the test. It is probably the fastest or the best way to design a system that is going to give you the sorts of immigrants that are going to lead to the highest levels of public support for that process.
Kristian, many people, and Sam sort of mentioned it very briefly there, is that immigration, broadly speaking, is a net economic benefit to the UK. Migrants tend to take less on average from the welfare system. Do you think those arguments need to be articulated better in order to detoxify the issue of immigration in domestic politics? Or do you think, as you said previously, that we need to focus on the cultural impact, because actually when you dig down into it, that's what people care more about?
Yeah, it is about that. And to go back to Sam's point, he said 100,000 people, that's roughly the level that you can successfully integrate. Well, that would depend on where they're coming from, wouldn't it? If you had 300,000 people coming from Australia, nobody would talk about integration. If you had 500,000 people coming from Canada, nobody would talk about integration. And that's why I'm saying a focus on numbers is completely misplaced. I'm not a complete open borders libertarian on immigration either, but what I really cannot see a case for is why you would have immigration restrictions for culturally similar countries. I accept cultural differences as a reason in principle for immigration controls, but I would say they are pretty much the only reason, the only valid reason that I recognize. So therefore, I would I would certainly have complete open borders for culturally similar countries. And now I know getting into the definition of who exactly qualifies as culturally similar, that may not always be so clear cut. And there I don't have strong feelings on where exactly the boundaries lie, but I would definitely have complete open borders, certainly for North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, and also Hong Kong, Singapore, potentially others. This is, as I said, who exactly you would include in this group. I don't have strong views on, but certainly on the principle that for culturally similar countries, however defined, that their immigration controls are just unnecessary bureaucracy, and that once you then try to, when you then try to pick the right ones by skill level or industry or whatever, then you get into central planning. Then you get into central planning of the labor force, as if the government could predict the needs of different sectors of the entire economy, which I absolutely don't believe in. And even for for the rest of the world, for countries where I wouldn't have complete open borders, I wouldn't go for a points-based system either. If anything, I would go for, yes, maybe a minimum skill level or a minimum salary threshold. But even that, I'd say I would use that more as a proxy for cultural integration, because generally speaking, migration of the highly skilled also tends to be less of an issue in terms of integration. Let's say academics from or groups like that, there it's pretty much irrelevant where they come from. They will integrate successfully, they will do well, and almost nobody will have a problem with them being here. So but even there, I would use the whether it's by salary or by skill level, or whether you do it indirectly, even that I would use more as a proxy for cultural integration than strictly speaking as an economic indicator.
I think the problem, if I might there, Emma, with Kristian's argument is that what he's just said is, he doesn't support the points-based system. And instead he said what he would prefer is a system that works around salary, qualifications, skill levels. And what he's essentially doing is describing the government's points-based immigration system. Salary, PhD, skill levels, these are exactly the things that are rooted into the points-based system that is currently created. Now, look, I'd agree with him. Under the old system of identifying workers in industries that are of particular need was unsuccessful. I think he's right to say that the bureaucrat is not a successful person, a successful entity to choose which industries can rise and fall. But we should be quite clear that the points-based system that this government has created is designed to pick and identify those with higher skills, higher salaries. People, it particularly focuses on those in academia, and I think he's right to say that they'll integrate whatever, but that's what the points-based system is doing.
Go on then, Kristian. Are you secretly a fan of a points-based system? You just didn't know it?
No, the points-based systems come in different varieties. The one that we currently have, the one that's been brought in at the beginning of this year, is probably the least bad version of it. I don't have a huge problem with it, precisely because it doesn't try to micromanage it. Yes, it is still within the confines of what you can describe as a points-based system, but it uses a small number of broad categories. So it doesn't try to select exactly the right type of person and by industry, but it uses a relatively small number of criteria. So I'm broadly okay with that system. I simplify it some more, but that's certainly a starting point. What I'm saying is I wouldn't apply this to the whole world. I would have that as the default system, the regular immigration system, and I would then, on top of that, also have a fast lane, have a free movement zone, and a bit like now, where as we have with COVID travel restrictions, where we have the green list and the amber list and the red list. I would have an immigration system a bit like that, except I wouldn't have a red list. There's no country that I would want to exclude from that, but there would be an amber list, and that would be something starting with the current points-based system, and then there would be a green list where there are which would work more or less like free movement used to work until the beginning of this year with the EU. I'd have something like that. It's just that I'd say this doesn't have to be limited to Europe. It can include Europe, but not by virtue of being Europe. It can be, the European countries can just be just another addition to that list.
Well, Sam, what do you think about that? If the points-based system were kind of the default, but then you had visa-free travel or no limit on numbers from, say, Kanzuk countries, or maybe not the EU and Hong Kong, maybe not quite as broad as Kristian's suggesting, but take Kanzuk, for example. Would you be supportive of that?
So broadly speaking, I would be in favour of that. I think especially if they're attached to negotiations over the free trade agreements. Mm-hmm. And I think in countries where there is broadly parable pay, across, you're likely not to see the sort of sudden and uncontrolled, unplanned immigration that we saw when the EU8 exceeded in 2004. We also have the benefit, of course, that average salaries in certainly in Australia and the US, I think Canada as well, are in excess of the UK's own. So if anything, what we're likely to see is an outflux rather than a sudden influx. I think that's right. I think you probably get into more difficulties. I'll leave Hong Kong aside. I think there are different reasons why Hong Kongers should all have the right to come to the UK should they choose. But I think where you're going to run into difficulties is the moment you open that up as a front on free trade deals, you're going to see an awful lot of countries with whom you are negotiating free trade deals looking for them. The obvious case will be India. There's a number of reasons why a free movement zone with India would not be a very good idea. But clearly, every time we talk about reducing barriers to trade with India, India having always had very high barriers to trade with everybody. That they have always historically wanted to associate removing those barriers to removing barriers on the movement of their people. That will be a difficulty. Now, I think it's a manageable difficulty, but I wouldn't be opposed to reducing that for those countries where there's a shared culture, shared values, and a parable economic status. I think South Africa is a good example where actually there's a shared legal system, a lot of shared values, shared language, but for a number of reasons, a free movement zone with South Africa wouldn't work or wouldn't be as successful. And I think there is an economics dimensions to it as well, which is that if you suddenly open the doors on two countries with widely divergent standards of living, you are likely to end up with more of the adverse outcomes that can arise through immigration.
Well, while we're talking about the economy, it's certainly going to be in need of a boost after the pandemic. And we've seen, it's probably too early to tell whether it's a long-term trend, but certainly an emerging trend of people leaving the UK during the pandemic, either, because of Brexit or because, they wanted to return to spend, the last 15 months of a pandemic with their families. Do you think we need to gear back towards encouraging migration as a way to deliver an economic boost, once the country's up and running, Kristian?
I wouldn't try to specifically encourage it either. I think politics should just be relatively neutral. It should be, the approach to migration should be relatively permissive, but I wouldn't want to go towards things like this did happen in the 1960s and 70s in various Western countries, that they specifically tried to recruit abroad, and not just companies, but that there were government programs. But there you get into conflicts, because there it would really be a political choice. Then it would be politically promoted, and I think the strongest defense of a relatively permissive migration system is just for me that I like the idea that people can choose where they want to live, and it should be down to individual choice. And then that's why, even though I'm not as I said, a complete open borders libertarian, I still always I still think that deviation from that and imposing restrictions, that should be in need of a special justification. That should not just be some default that we accept, but the person who wants those restrictions the onus should be on them to make a case for that. But once you think about it in those terms, that migration should be about voluntary movement, then it also follows on the flip side of that governments shouldn't try to specifically induce people to move. It should really then just be the voluntary decisions that that people make. That's why I always hate this term when somebody says we are importing people from somewhere, because it sounds like as if the person moving here had no agency over this. They somehow get plucked out of a country and moved to Britain almost against their will. And I always like to counter that argument by pointing out people choose to move here. It's not something that this government decides, or that companies in the country decide. It's a decision that people make. But once you had a government program that tried to offer some inducement for people to move, then that would no longer be really true, and then you could almost use the term import, or at least you would start to get into that territory, and that's why I'd rather steer clear of that. So permissive system, yes. Relatively open borders, yes. But specific encouragement, no.
Sam, do you agree? You know, migration will obviously play some role in boosting the economy, but, you know, shouldn't government...
So I think there are a few exceptions to that as a broad rule. I think for those individuals who have elite skills or elite wealth that is in a limited and discrete supply worldwide, we should be looking at a different model. So currently the UK has investment visas. I think they're a sensible program. I think there's clearly a need in academia to attract elite talent, and I think there is a role for benefits that the state can offer in attracting those, and that there is a clear market benefit. There's a clear incentive for us in attracting as much of that talent as we possibly can do, and I think that's what's lying behind a lot of what the government is trying to do in and around the science space, and through the points-based system. I suspect we'll have to go further, especially as academia is undergoing its own challenges at the moment, particularly in the STEM space, in and around the broader decoupling that's going on between Western universities and Chinese students from People's Republic of China, not from Hong Kong or Taiwan. But as security concerns have come along, there's going to be some talent difficulties there, and being able to recruit and retain the absolute best talent there from anywhere in the world is very specialised. You choose your designers of hyper small computers. There's about 5 people around the world. Yeah. Being able to win them over to the UK carries a very, very significant benefit, and I do think there is a role for the state to play in attracting that elite talent to British universities.
Right, one last question for both of you. If you could make a change either to the UK's immigration system or in Britain, in Brits' attitudes towards immigration, what sort of change would you like to see? And Sam, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so the change I would make is not actually to the immigration system, it's to our process of integration. And it's in and around English language, and particularly in the case of, everybody thinks that the majority of immigration to the UK comes for economic means, and they'd be broadly right. But certainly the second biggest factor is familial reunification of various sorts. That's particularly a driving factor in immigration from the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And often what you're involving there is people coming over, relatives of existing immigrants, and it's those channels in which you've got the lowest level of English speaking skills. I think that's in any event that you arrive at non-English speaking immigrants, that's when you maximize the disadvantages of immigration and you minimize the advantages. So I would require much higher standards of English to be able to immigrate. And for those that are already here, I think the government does need to step in and improve both the provision of and the regular monitoring of English language, not just as a pathway to citizenship, but as a pathway to settled status or right to remain.
Kristian, what about you?
Yeah, I said in the beginning, there are these two very different issues. the cultural impact, the integration issue, and the economic one. I'd say on the first one, there isn't that much that the government can do. Integration is something that has to just happen spontaneously. Maybe the kinds of things that Sam was talking about could help, maybe not. Don't know a huge amount about that. But what I would say is about the economics. Economic issues don't have to be an issue at all. Economic barriers, economic problems that we associate with migration don't have to be a problem at all. They are only a problem because we make it one. And that is where I think policy changes could make a huge difference. That is especially around the housing market. I know that that's one of my long-term obsessions, and I know I always say that, but I really think if we had a much more flexible supply side of the housing market, then a lot of the problems attributed to migration would automatically go away. And this is something which would make sense even if we had much lower numbers of migration. It's simply the case that for demographic reasons, compared to previous generations, we have a much smaller household size. We have people want to move out, leave their family home earlier. We have more single people, and people live longer, and that also means that more likely to live alone at some point. And for all those demographic reasons, household size has been falling, and that leads to an increase in demand for housing space. This is an issue that we would have even if net migration was zero, and even if international net migration was zero, it would still be true that people move around the country. You still have people coming from the north and moving to the more prosperous cities of the southeast. And that's not just London. There's even more extreme cases. And Oxford has the highest ratio of average house prices to average incomes, because lots of people want to live there, and they have a very strong NIMBY movement that blocks all development. Oxford could accommodate lots of people if they liberalize their housing market, and they could still preserve the inner city, of course. It would mean an outward expansion and build on low value agricultural land. That's the kind of thing that would make sense anyway, even without migration, but it would also have the added benefit of resolving some of the problems that people associate with migration.
Well, we'll have you back for a future episode on how we fix the housing crisis, Kristian. Don't you worry. Thanks, Kristian and Sam, for joining me, and thanks for watching. Be sure to let us know in the comments whether either of our panelists today have managed to convince you to change your minds. You can follow both Sam and Kristian online. Kristian tweets at K_Niemietz, and Sam is at Sam W. Armstrong. As well as subscribing to the IEA YouTube channel, which I hope you all already do, you can now support the IEA on Patreon, where we've set up a membership platform that allows our followers to donate solely towards our digital work. While subscribing, you get exclusive IEA perks, benefits, and priority access to our content, as well as much more. One of the great benefits is the chance to watch this show 24 hours before anyone else. If you'd like to contribute, if you'd like to help the IEA continue to create amazing digital content, you can click the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/IEA London. Thanks for watching.